What is a woman worth when the one thing she is told she was made for is the one thing her body cannot do? In the dust-choked frontier town of prosperity, Elara was about to find out. Her value, her father declared to the smoke-filled saloon, was less than that of a barren field. He gripped her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like desperate roots seeking water where there was none. "She's a good worker," he slurred, his voice thick with whiskey and failure. "Keeps a clean house, and she's quiet. Won't give a man no trouble." Elara stood numbly beside him, the scent of stale beer and regret filling her nostrils. The faces staring back at her were a blur of leering curiosity and pity. She felt their eyes on her like a physical weight, pressing down on the shame that had been her constant companion for 2 long years. 2 years of marriage to Gideon, the blacksmith's son, a man whose love had cooled as her womb remained empty. She remembered the whispers that followed her through the town, the bitter tonics from the midwife that scorched her throat, the nightly prayers that went unanswered. It all ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, final judgment. Gideon had taken another wife, a plump, giggling girl who promised his mother a dynasty of sons. Elara was sent back to her father in disgrace, with nothing but the dress on her back and the hollow ache in her heart. And now, her father, a man broken by a failed gold claim and drowning in debt, was making his final, desperate gamble. He shoved her forward slightly. "Anyone just settle my debt with the barkeep, and she's yours." The silence that followed was heavier than any jeer. The men looked away, the women in the corner clucked their tongues. Elara closed her eyes, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. Then, a chair scraped against the wooden floorboards. A man rose from a shadowy corner, a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, built like the mountains that loomed over the town, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. A worn leather hat shadowed his face, but Elara could see a jawline carved from granite and a beard thick with dust and time. He moved without a sound, his worn boots making no impression on the noisy floor. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the other men. He walked directly to the bar, pulled a heavy deerskin pouch from his coat, and loosened the drawstring. A stream of shimmering gold dust poured onto the polished wood, far more than enough to cover her father's pathetic debt. The saloon fell silent. Even her father, in his drunken hatch, seemed stunned. The man scooped the dust back into his pouch, leaving a generous pile for the barkeep, and then finally, he turned his gaze on Elara. His eyes, she saw, were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no cruelty, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod towards the door. The message was clear. Her father, suddenly sobered by the sight of the gold, grabbed her arm one last time. "Go on, then. You belong to him now." Elara picked up her small, pathetic bundlia spare pair of worn shoes, a tiny locket holding a faded picture of her mother, and followed the silent man out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. His wagon, hitched to a single, sturdy mule, was waiting. He didn't offer a hand, just waited patiently as she hauled herself over the side. He passed her a canteen without a word. The water was cold and clean, and it tasted like freedom and a new kind of prison all at once. They rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the pity behind, heading towards the jagged, pine-covered mountains. For a long time, the only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hooves of the mule. Elara stole glances at him. His hands on the reins were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who wrestled a living from the earth itself. Finally, her own voice, raspy from disuse, broke the silence. "Why?" she whispered, her question barely audible over the wind. He didn't turn to look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "4 children," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Their mother is gone. I don't have time for courting." So that's what she was. A hired hand. A convenience. Not a wife, not even a person, just a solution to a problem. But as the wagon rattled on, a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to flicker in her chest. For the first time in 2 years, she was heading to a place where her worth wouldn't be measured by the fruit of her womb. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Cormac's cabin was less a building and more a part of the mountain itself, nestled in a hollow of towering pines and ancient aspens. It seemed to have grown from the very rock and timber that surrounded it, with a roof of rough-hewn shingles patched with moss and a stone chimney that breathed a thin ribbon of smoke into the crisp air. The porch groaned a weary welcome as they stepped onto it. 4 small faces, like pale moons, peered out from behind a grimy window pane before vanishing into the shadows. 4 sets of eyes, wide with suspicion and a wild, untamed curiosity. Cormac pushed open the heavy plank door. "This is Elara," he announced to the dimly lit room. "She'll be staying." The oldest, a boy of about 10 with his father's stormy eyes and a defiant scowl, folded his arms across his chest. The second boy, a whirlwind of red hair and freckles, just stared, his thumb stuck firmly in his mouth. A little girl with a tangle of dark curls clung to Cormac's leg like a vine, and in a cradle near the hearth, a baby whimpered softly. "Finn, Rory, Maeve, and Liam," Cormac said, pointing to each in turn. He then gestured to a steep ladder leading to a loft. "Your room is up there. There's hot water in the kettle on the stove." Elara climbed the ladder, her legs feeling as heavy as lead. The loft was small, but a bed with a clean, patched quilt sat beneath a small window that looked out over a sea of pine trees. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs sighing under her weight, and for the first time since leaving prosperity, she allowed herself to cry. Not for what she had lost, but for the vast, terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. She hadn't chosen this life, but for the first time in a long time, no one was demanding she be something she was not. No one was looking at her as if she were broken. Here, in this wild, lonely place, she was simply needed. The days that followed were a blur of clumsy, thankless work. Elara, who had only ever known the neat, orderly life of a townswoman, was a fish out of water. The wood-burning stove was a temperamental beast that either billowed smoke or refused to light. Her first attempt at baking bread resulted in a batch of rock-hard lumps that even the chickens refused to peck at. She tried to mend the children's torn clothes, her fingers fumbling and clumsy with a needle and thread. The children were like a pack of feral kittens, wary and quick to scratch. Finn watched her with open contempt, his silence a constant judgment. Rory seemed to delight in creating chaos, hiding her shoes and putting frogs in the water bucket. Maeve would scuttle away whenever Elara came near, hiding her face in her hands. Only baby Liam, with his innocent, trusting eyes, offered any solace. She would rock his cradle, humming old lullabies her mother had sung to her, her voice thin and reedy but filled with a tenderness she hadn't known she still possessed. Weeks bled into one another. Elara and Cormac moved around each other in a world of near silence, their communication reduced to necessities. Yet, in that silence, she began to notice things. The way he left a pail of fresh milk on the porch every morning. The way a stack of perfectly chopped kindling always appeared by the stove when the old one ran low. He never offered praise, but one afternoon, after she'd spent hours scrubbing the grimy floors until the wood gleamed, she saw him pause in the doorway, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he turned and walked away. The turning point came with the first winter storm. A blizzard descended from the mountains with a terrifying fury, trapping them inside the cabin as the wind howled like a hungry wolf. In the middle of the second night, Maeve began to cry, a weak, feverish way. By morning, her small body was burning with heat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Cormac, a man who could fell a giant pine with an axe, stood over his daughter's sickbed, his face a mask of helpless terror. He looked lost, adrift in a sea of fear. It was then that something inside Elara shifted. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks receded, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. She sent Cormac to fetch snow to melt for water and began to work, drawing on the long-forgotten knowledge her grandmother, an herbalist, had taught her. She brewed a tea from willow bark and mint leaves, forcing the bitter liquid past Maeve's cracked lips. She bathed her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring soft, soothing words, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of the child's illness. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not sleep. She held Maeve in her arms, willing her own strength into the child's fragile body. On the third morning, as the storm finally broke and a pale sun peeked through the clouds, the fever broke with it. Maeve opened her eyes, her gaze clear for the first time in days, and whispered a single, raspy word: pancakes. Elara looked up and saw Cormac standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders slumped with relief. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes, it was as if he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a hired hand, not as a solution to a problem, but as the woman who had fought off death and brought his daughter back from the brink. Elara, exhausted to her very bones, could only manage a small, weary nod. She couldn't smile, not yet, but deep inside, in the cold, hollow place where her heart used to be, something small and warm had begun to thaw. The next morning, after she had dressed the other children and settled them with a breakfast of porridge, Elara found a steaming mug of tea waiting for her on the hearth. Next to it was a small, crudely folded piece of paper. She picked it up. Scrawled in rough, uneven letters were 2 words, "Thank you." There was no name, no flourish, but the lump that formed in her throat was more eloquent than any signature. She sat on the worn bench, cradling the warm mug in her hands. The tea was strong and tasted faintly of pine, and it warmed her all the way through. She looked out the window at the snow-covered forest, a world made clean and new. Something was changing. Not in a sudden, dramatic rush, but slowly, quietly, like the melting of a long winter's snow. She had been discarded like a piece of broken furniture, sold like livestock, her entire worth measured and found wanting by a single, biological failing. And yet here, in this rough-hewn cabin with a man of few words and his 4 wild children, someone had seen her. They had seen her effort, her care, her quiet perseverance in the face of her own failures. Later that day, as she was sweeping the floor, little Rory, the mischievous one, crept up beside her. He tugged on her apron, and with a shy, gap-toothed grin, he held up a small, smooth stone he had found. "For you," he whispered before darting away. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a real, genuine smile touched Elara's lips. Not because she had to, not because it was expected, but because a small, freckle-faced boy had given her a treasure, and in that moment, she felt rich beyond measure. The harsh winter slowly gave way to a tentative spring. The ice on the creek began to crack and melt, and small, green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth. Elara no longer cried herself to sleep. Her hands, once soft and smooth, were now calloused and capable. Her voice, once thin and hesitant, was now strong and clear as she taught the children their letters, scratching the alphabet with charcoal on a piece of smooth bark. She taught Maeve how to braid her own hair and showed Finn how to patch a tear in his trousers. They had started calling her Miss Elara, a title she neither encouraged nor corrected. But a deep-seated fear still lingered in her bones, a phantom ache from a wound that had not fully healed. One afternoon, Cormac asked if she would ride into prosperity with him. They needed flour and salt, and the blacksmith had finished repairing a broken axe head. He didn't offer an explanation, just handed her the reins to the mule as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The town felt different now. The whispers still followed her, but they were tinged with a new kind of curiosity. As Cormac dealt with the storekeeper, Elara stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. And then she heard it. A familiar, cruelly sharp voice that cut through the low hum of the street. Well, if it isn't the Barren mare herself. Elara turned slowly. There, by the mercantile, stood Gideon's mother, fanning herself with a lace fan, a smug, self-satisfied smirk on her face. Beside her, his new wife, Beatrice, preened like a prize hen, one hand resting possessively on her still flat stomach. "Is that really her?" Beatrice asked, her voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "The very one," the older woman replied, her voice dripping with scorn. "Pretty as the picture, but cursed. Couldn't even give my Gideon a whining pup, let alone a son." Beatrice lifted her chin. "Well, I shall. A fine, strong boy to carry on the family name. Unlike some people, who are as useless as a cracked pot." Elara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt the old shame rise in her throat, hot and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to rage, to tell them that a woman's worth was not measured in sons, but the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, trapped in a fresh wave of humiliation. She turned to walk away, to flee back to the safety of the mountains. Then, a large, warm hand settled on her shoulder. It was Cormac. He had emerged from the shadows of the general store, his boots still caked with mountain mud, his eyes like thunderclouds. He didn't even glance at the two women. His gaze was fixed on Elara. Then he spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire street. "This woman," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "is the one who sings my daughter to sleep. She's the one who taught my son not to be afraid of the dark. She is the one who took a house full of sorrow and made it a home." The two women stared, their mouths agape, their smug superiority collapsing under the weight of his simple, powerful words. Cormac gently took Elara's arm and led her back to the wagon. Nothing more needed to be said. Elara was silent for the entire ride back to the cabin. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat by the creek, weaving a small coronet of wild flowers. She didn't know why, she just felt the need to create something beautiful with her own hands. In the weeks that followed, new whispers began to drift up from the town. Beatrice, the proud, fertile new wife, was not pregnant after all. Her belly remained stubbornly flat, her disposition grew ever more sour. Rumors began to circulate, ugly and persistent. In her desperation to secure her position, she had concocted a desperate, dangerous lie, claiming a pregnancy that didn't exist. The truth, as it always does, eventually came out. Gideon, humiliated and enraged, had thrown her out, tearing down the curtains in the nursery they had prepared and cursing her name. A few weeks later, when Elara was in town buying seeds, she ran into him. Her former husband. Gideon looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with lines of defeat. He clutched his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. Elara, he began, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. I see that now. You were the only one who ever truly cared. The only one who, she cut him off, her voice steady and clear. I remember the day you let your mother spit on my name. I remember the day you cast me aside like spoiled meat, because my body would not do what yours couldn't do either. He flinched as if struck. I was a fool, he stammered. Elara took a step closer, not in anger, but with a newfound strength that radiated from her. I have 4 children who reach for me when they wake. I have a man who has never once asked me for what I cannot give, only for what I am willing to share. My home is full, Gideon. It's full of warmth and laughter and peace. She paused, letting the words sink in. I would rather spend my days sweeping ashes from Cormac's hearth than spend another minute as a porcelain trophy in your silent house. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Elara turned and walked away without a backward glance. Across the street, Cormac was waiting for her, a heavy sack of flour slung over his shoulder. He had seen it all. His face showed no triumph, no smug satisfaction. It showed something deeper. A quiet, steady gratitude. A love that wasn't born of pity or convenience, but of choice. A choice made not just once in a dusty saloon, but every single day. The sky was a bruised purple and orange, a tired sunset settling over the valley. Elara stepped outside to fetch water from the well, the evening air cool on her skin. The children were asleep, the cabin was quiet, and a sense of peace had settled deep in her bones. At first, she didn't see the figure leaning against the fence post, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the pines. It was Jade, a miner from the other side of the ridge, a man known more for the bottle in his hand than the work he produced. Well, look what we have here, he slurred, his voice unpleasantly slick. Cormac's pretty little mare he brought back from town. They say you're Barren, but you seem to do just fine with his litter, don't you? Elara's whole body went rigid. It's late, Jade. You should go home. He pushed himself off the fence and took a step towards her, a cruel smirk on his face. I just wanted a closer look. Cormac keeps you locked up tighter than a bag of gold. She turned to go back inside, but he moved with a drunkard's surprising speed. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was rough, his fingers greasy and strong. Come on, he snarled, his breath foul. After all the talk in town, you owe a man a smile. Before she could scream, before she could even think to pull away, a blur of motion shot across the yard. It was Cormac. He was there in an instant, a silent, avenging shadow. There were no words, no warnings. Just a single, clean, powerful strike of his fist that connected with Jade's jaw with a sickening crack. The miner crumpled to the ground like a sack of wet laundry. The world went utterly still. Even the wind in the pines seemed to hold its breath. Cormac stood over the moaning man, his chest heaving, a dark trickle of blood dripping from his knuckles. Elara stared, her heart hammering against her ribs, but not with fear. She had never seen this man raise his voice, let alone his hand. He didn't spare another glance for the man on the ground. He turned to her, his eyes dark and fierce. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and ragged. She could only nod, her own eyes wide, her hand trembling where Jade had grabbed it. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though she wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. He stepped closer, pulled the worn red bandana from his neck, and gently, so gently, took her hand. He carefully wrapped the soft cloth around her wrist, covering the red marks his fingers had left. "No one touches you again," he said, and it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Then he looked down at his own hand, bruised and bleeding from the blow. "Fool," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Inside the cabin, by the warm light of the fire, Elara gently washed the cut on his knuckles with warm water and a clean cloth. The silence in the room was different now. It was charged with a new, unspoken tension. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I was leaving." "He shouldn't have put his hands on you," Cormac replied, his gaze softer now, the storm in his eyes having passed. She continued to clean the wound, her touch feather-light. "You don't seem the fighting type. I like it even less when someone hurts you." She blinked hard, a sudden wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I was crying," she confessed in a small voice. "But not because I was scared. It's just no one's ever done that for me before. Ever." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression one of profound tenderness, as if he were seeing something incredibly precious and impossibly strong all at once. When she was finished, she started to pull away, but he caught her hand, lacing his rough, calloused fingers with hers. "Thank you," she whispered. Cormac gave a slight shrug of his broad shoulders. "I guess I don't want to live in a world where men like that think they can talk to you that way." A small, grateful smile touched her lips. Her wrist still ached, but her heart, for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt held. Outside, the stars blazed in the vast, dark sky. And inside the cabin, the man who never raised his voice had raised his hand for her. And she, the woman who had always been told she was not enough, had finally been seen as something worth defending. It wasn't love, not the kind she had read about in books. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more real. It was the kind of love you could build a life on. It was a morning of biting frost, so cold the air felt brittle, and each breath bloomed as a white cloud. Elara was in the kitchen, her hands deep in a ball of dough, the familiar rhythm of needing a comforting start to the day. Suddenly, a sharp, terrified scream ripped through the quiet morning air. It was one of the children. She dropped the ball, a puff of flour exploding around her, and ran, her bare feet numb against the frozen ground. She found him by the woodpile. Finn, Cormac's eldest, the one who had resisted her the longest, was crumpled on the ground. His leg was twisted beneath him at a sickening, unnatural angle. A wood-splitting axe lay nearby, its edge glinting ominously. Oh, sweet heavens, Elara breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. Cormac was there a second later, his face a grim, stony mask. He scooped the boy into his arms with an impossible gentleness. "Boil water," he commanded, his voice tight with controlled panic. "And get the bandages from the chest." Elara flew back to the cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. When she returned, Cormac had laid Finn on the large kitchen table, his face pale and beaded with sweat. With a steady hand, Cormac slicked the boy's trouser leg. The wound beneath was a deep, ragged gash, bleeding profusely. Elara's hands trembled as she pressed a clean cloth to the wound, trying to staunch the flow. Finn cried out, a sound of pure agony. I know, little one," she murmured, her own voice a thin thread of sound. "I know it hurts. Just hold on. Please, just hold on." Her own tears fell onto the boy's leg as she worked, her fingers becoming slick with his blood. She cleaned the wound, her movements sure and steady despite the tremor in her hands, her mind focused on her grandmother's long-ago lessons. She poured a burning antiseptic over the gash, bandaged it tightly, whispering prayers with every knot she tied. Then, through gritted teeth, a small, pained voice spoke. "Don't cry, Ma." Elara froze. The word hung in the warm, steam-filled air of the kitchen. "Ma." Finn blinked up at her, his stormy eyes glassy with pain. You make the best biscuits," he whispered, his lips trembling. "You sing like my mother used to." Elara reached out a shaky hand and stroked his cheek. This time, the tears came in an unstoppable flood. Later, with Finn resting by the fire, his leg elevated and splinted, the other children gathered around him. Rory brought him his favorite wooden horse. Maeve tucked a blanket around his shoulders. "Pa said you were staying," Maeve said, her small, serious face looking up at Elara. "So I guess that means you're our mana." Elara couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. And that was enough. From that day on, that's what they called her. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was just right. A name earned not through biology, but through bandage and biscuit, through lullaby and love. Cormac had watched it all in silence. He'd seen the way she held their hands in the dark, the way she patiently braided Maeve's hair, the way her face softened when they whispered her new name. That night, after the house had fallen quiet, he found her on the porch, gazing up at the stardusted sky. "I was never good with words," he began, his voice low. "You know that?" She looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "You say enough." He nodded, his gaze distant. "When I put that gold on the bar, I thought I was giving you a way out of that town. I never figured I had the right to keep you here." Elara turned to face him fully, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. "I figured you'd leave once you got your feet under you," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "And if that's what you want, I won't stop you. I won't hold you to a bargain that started in a saloon." She looked at him, at this quiet, solid man who had become the center of her world. "I used to think that love was someone choosing you on sight," she said, her voice soft. "But I've learned it's something better. It's them choosing you later, when they know exactly who you are. Cormac's jaw was tight. If you are not going to throw me out, she added, a tremor in her voice, then I'm not going. The porch boards groaned as he took a step closer and took her hands in his. I may not have given these children life, she said, but they have made me into someone I never thought I could be. And you let me be that person, without asking for anything in return. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled not with desire, but with a reverence that took her breath away. I only ever wanted you to be safe, he murmured. And now I want more than safety, she replied. He drew her into his arms, not with the grasp of a man claiming a prize, but with the gentle embrace of a man who has been given a second chance and is wise enough to hold it close. The fire crackled inside, and outside, the frost settled on the earth. But between them a warmth had bloomed, a silent promise, a family forged not in blood but in belonging. The morning sun filtered through the pines, casting long, golden shafts of light across the path. Elara walked hand in hand with Finn, her eldest, on the dirt track that led to the one-room schoolhouse on the other side of the valley. His small hand was firm in hers, a comforting weight. At 10 years old, he had a seriousness in his bright eyes that sometimes made her want to scold him and kiss his forehead all at once. He was quieter than usual this morning, clutching the new reading primer to his chest like a shield. When they reached the small, clapboard building, the teacher, a tall, thin man with spectacles that seemed too large for his face, greeted them with a polite nod. We are just finishing up some paperwork, the teacher said, peering at a ledger. I just need to complete the birth register. Full name, son. Finn stood up a little straighter. Finn Cormac, he said proudly. The teacher scribbled it down. And your mother's name? A pause. The teacher's pen hovered over the paper. Elara held her breath. Then Finn looked the teacher square in the eye, his voice clear and unwavering. Elara Cormac. She blinked. Her heart did a strange little stutter step, as if it had forgotten its rhythm for a moment. That's your mother's name by marriage, then, the teacher asked, a little confused. Finn nodded with the solemn dignity of a boy who had lived more life than his years suggested. It's the name we call her by, he said simply. The teacher, accustomed to the tangled family lines of the frontier, simply smiled and wrote the name down. Elara Cormac. For the rest of the walk home, Elara felt a warm, sweet ache behind her eyes. All her life, she had been given names by others. Elara, daughter of a failed prospector. Elara, the barren wife of Gideon. The woman from the mountains. But this name, this one, had not been given by law or by men. It had been spoken by a child. A child with no reason to lie and no need to flatter. It was simply his truth. When she returned to the cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine greeted her. Cormac was sitting at the kitchen table, carving a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. He looked up as she entered. The boy do all right, he asked. More than all right, she whispered. That evening, as she was folding laundry by the fire, Cormac came and sat beside her. He placed something on the table. It was a small leather-bound journal, its pages clean and empty. He rested his large hands on his knees. I don't have much to give, he said slowly, other than splinters and dust. But if anyone's earned a blank page, it's you. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing the crisp, white paper. I used to dream of starting over, she said. But I never imagined I'd get to write the story myself. Cormac nodded. Write whatever you want. It's yours. She looked from his face to the journal. You'll only read it if I let you. He met her gaze. It's your story. She picked up the pen he'd left beside the book. It felt heavy in her hand like a promise. And slowly, in a script that was steady and sure, she wrote her first words. Today, I was given a name by a son I did not bear. She didn't need to look up to know he was watching. The warmth of his presence beside her, the quiet strength that filled the cabin, the way Finn had spoken her name was all real. When she was done, Cormac gently took the pen from her fingers and placed it on the table. He leaned in and rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For giving us time enough to love you right. And there, in the warm, fire-lit room, the woman who was once sold for less than the price of a cow was reborn. Not by law, not by marriage, but by something far deeper. Something true. The drought came not as a sudden event, but as a slow, creeping curse. For 7 weeks, the sky remained a relentless, brassy blue. The green hills of the valley turned a cracked and dusty brown, the earth itself seeming to forget how to breathe. The creek behind the cabin, once a place of laughter and splashing, dwindled to a muddy, stagnant trickle. The corn stalks in their small garden withered, then the beans. Cormac spoke little, but the weight on his shoulders grew heavier with each rainless day. He worked harder, ate less, and came home each evening covered in a film of dust and defeat. Elara watched the children grow thinner, their laughter quieter. She heard their stomachs rumble in the night, though they never complained. But Elara would not surrender to the silence. She rose before dawn each morning, hauling bucket after bucket of water from the deep well. She covered her hair with a scarf, wrapped her hands in rags, and went to war with the dying garden. She dug at the iron-hard soil, turning it, aerating it, making space for roots to live, even where life seemed impossible. Every morning she watered the thirsty ground, every evening she checked the soil. When the leaves of the tomato plants began to curl, she would sing to them, pouring a little water at their roots as if whispering a secret. One evening, Cormac staggered into the cabin, his face ashen, his knees threatening to buckle. Elara caught him before he could fall. Just tired, he rasped, but his skin was burning with fever. For 2 nights, he burned like a forge. Elara never left his side, sponging his brow, forcing broth between his cracked lips, telling him stories of green hills and warm bread, even as her own voice trembled with fear. On the second night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Cormac tossed in his fevered sleep. His hand groped blindly for hers. Elara, he whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. Don't you leave me. Not you. She leaned close, her lips almost touching his temple. I will never leave, she whispered back. They need me here. I belong here. The fever broke at dawn. When he opened his eyes, she was still there, her face smudged with dirt, her hands rough, but her gaze as steady and warm as ever. You look terrible, he rasped, a weak attempt at a joke. She let out a small, relieved laugh. You should see yourself. And besides, she said, a real smile breaking through her exhaustion, the garden isn't dead. Not yet. Tiny green shoots were beginning to push through the soil, stubbornly seeking life. A week later, Rory came running into the cabin, shouting, "Elara! There's a tomato!" She ran outside with him, and there it was. A single, small, defiant red orb, clinging to its vine as if in challenge to the sun itself. Cormac came and stood beside her, looking at that one piece of fruit. "How?" he asked, his voice thick with awe. She looked at him, her eyes shining. "You taught me," she said softly, "that the things worth saving are rarely the easy things." He looked down at her work-worn hands. Then, without a word, he bent his head and kissed each of her knuckles. A gesture as gentle and as welcome as rain. That night, they divided the single tomato into 6 perfect, paper-thin slices. Everyone swore it was the most delicious thing they had ever tasted. Later, as the fire died down, and the children slept curled on the floor, Cormac took her hand. "I don't have much left," he confessed, his voice low. "The earth is dry and my arms are giving out. All I have is this place, these children and you." She turned to him, her smile a beacon in the dim light. "That is more than enough. Because before you, I had a name no one wanted to say. Now, I have a garden that remembers my hands, children who call me home, and a man who asked me to stay, even in a drought." He kissed her knuckles again. "You never needed rain," he said, "to make something beautiful grow." And outside, under a sky that was still waiting, the garden, like her, held on. It was alive. The years passed like the turning of the seasons, but the wind in the hills never changed. It still carried the scent of dry earth, sun-baked pine needles, and the stubborn sweetness of the wild mustard that grew where nothing else would. Elara's garden, once just a handful of seeds tossed onto cracked soil, now stretched green and vibrant behind the cabin. It was not a neat or orderly garden. It sprawled and climbed, spilling over rocks and fences, but it was alive, and it was theirs. Every morning, Cormac would stand on the porch, watching her tend to it. He never spoke, just watched in a comfortable silence, as if he were witnessing daily proof that miracles don't need to shout to be real. Then, one spring, men came from the city. Men in clean boots with maps and easy smiles. "A new reservoir," one of them announced, unrolling a blueprint. "The dam will flood this whole valley. It's for the good of the territory. We'll pay you a fair price, of course." Elara stood beside Cormac, her hands tucked into her apron. "Think of what you could give your children," the man added smoothly. "A real house in town, a new start." Cormac didn't look at the men or their papers. He looked past them, at the trees he had planted, at the fence he had built with his own hands, at the worn swing Elara had hung from a great oak tree. He looked at all the small, invisible markers of a life. All the things that made this piece of dirt a home. He simply raised a hand. "This land isn't for sale." That night, they hammered a sign into the ground at the edge of their property. A single plank of wood with 2 words carved into it, "Not for sale." The news spread. Some in town laughed. Others nodded in silent understanding. The years continued to spool out. The children grew, married, and had children of their own. The cabin filled with new noises, the smell of fresh bread, and the pitter-patter of small feet. Life sunk its roots deep into the hillside, unseen from a distance, but unbreakable. And the garden never failed. It always came back, not just with tomatoes, but with beans and corn and sunflowers so tall a child could hide behind them. One autumn afternoon, a grandson asked Cormac, "Grandpa, why do you call this Elara's garden?" Cormac led the boy to the entrance, where a weathered arch of wood stood over the path. Carved into it were the words, "She did not give me my blood," Cormac said simply, "but she gave me my life." The boy blinked. "You mean she gave you a new start?" Cormac smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "No, son. I mean she gave me everything." When Elara passed, they buried her at the edge of the garden, under the same oak tree where the swing had once hung. On the simple headstone, Cormac carved a single line, "Here grew a woman who was given nothing and offered everything." He sat by her side every morning, until the morning he did not come back up. They laid him to rest beside her, under the whispering leaves of the tree. The garden never stopped growing. And long after the government built their dam in another valley, long after the men in suits forgot they had ever come, travelers would sometimes pass the old fence and read the sign, "Not for sale." Because some places remember the people who refused to leave. And sometimes, the most barren hills bloom for those who chose to love when no one else would. If this story of a love that was grown, not given, has touched something true in your heart, then you've found the right place. Our stories are about resilience, about sacrifice, and about the kind of love that springs from the dust and endures through the drought. Stories like Elara's and Cormac's remind us that even in the most forgotten corners of the world, the deepest roots can take hold. If you want more tales of grit, strength, and hard-won hope, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell so you never miss a journey into the wild heart of the human spirit. Because here, love is never easy, but it is always, always worth the fight.